Under a Thanksgiving video my son posted from his Portland dining room, I saw a bottle I recognized before I recognized a single face. It was the 1998 Reserve, the last bottle from our first harvest. The one my wife made me promise we would never open without a reason worthy of the wine. They had a reason. I was not it. That Monday morning, I called my estate attorney. Thank you for being here with me. Before we begin, tell me in the comments what city or country you are watching from. This story has traveled farther than I ever expected, and I would love to know where it found you. This story contains fictional elements added for clarity and purpose. Any similarity to existing names or locations is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is one worth holding on to. I have always been the kind of man who checks things twice. Not because I doubt what I saw the first time, but because a thing that cannot be undone deserves the extra 10 seconds. June used to say I measured the world before I walked into it. She meant it as a compliment about half the time. The other half, she was telling me to stop thinking and start moving. She was right both ways, which was the particular inconvenience of being married to someone who understood you better than you understood yourself. It was 9:15 on a Thursday evening, the 28th of November. Thanksgiving. The kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove. The small one that casts a half circle on the counter and leaves the rest of the room in shadow. I had not turned on the overhead since sometime in October. There was no reason to light a room that only one person used. The rain had started around 7. The slow coastal kind that moves through the Willamette Valley without announcing itself. Through the back window, I could see the vineyard in the last of the evening light, 45 acres of Pinot Noir vines running in parallel lines toward the low hills to the west, each row stripped bare for winter, the cordons dark and angular against the gray sky, like the ribcage of something patient. I had been sitting in that chair most evenings for 4 years, since June died. The house had not changed. I kept the heat at 66. I kept the gutters clear. Every morning I drove 22 miles to the winery, walked the vine rows before the fog lifted, checked the irrigation lines and the trellis tension and the soil moisture, then drove home before dark. That had been the shape of my days. It suited me in a way most people did not understand, and I had stopped explaining it to anyone who had not earned the explanation. My phone lit up on the kitchen table. TikTok. I followed exactly one account. My son Marcus had posted 43 minutes ago. The video loaded immediately. The setting was the Portland townhouse Marcus shared with his wife Tessa, rearranged since my last visit in March. The lighting was warm and perfectly, even in a way no kitchen fixture produces on its own. Someone had positioned a deliberate light source off-frame. This was not a phone propped on a counter catching a spontaneous moment. The table was set for celebration. White dishes, cloth napkins, a centerpiece of autumn branches. Around it sat Tessa's parents, her brother and his wife. 2 colleagues of Marcus I had met once, and Tessa herself, her hand resting on Marcus's arm in the particular way she rested it when she wanted a photograph to tell a specific story. Marcus sat at the head. Clean-shaven, collar open, one button past professional, the posture of a man who has received very good news and has already decided how the room should feel about it. And in the center of the table, between the autumn branches and the lifted glasses, was a bottle I knew better than any face in that frame. The 1998 Reserve. I had designed that label myself. Sitting at this kitchen table 26 years ago with a felt-tip pen and cream cardstock. Because June said our first vintage deserved a label made by hand. The handwriting was mine. The wine inside was the first we ever produced from this land. 43 cases of Pinot Noir picked by our own hands in the 3rd week of October, our skin stained purple for days. We kept 6 bottles. Over the years, we opened 5, each for a reason June considered worthy. The birth of Marcus. The year we paid off the mortgage. The night Ernesto Medina agreed to stay on as vineyard manager. The evening after June's heart diagnosis when we decided we were not going to be afraid. And the night before her surgery, when she poured 2 glasses and was quiet for a long time, then said, "If this is the last bottle we open together, it was a good one." It was not the last. She came through. She lived 11 more months. But that was the 5th bottle. And one remained. She made me promise. June was specific about things that mattered and imprecise about everything else. She said, "That bottle does not get opened for a birthday, or a holiday, or because someone had a good day at work. It gets opened when something happens that is worthy of what it cost us to make it." I had kept that promise for 26 years. The bottle stayed in the cellar, 3rd rack, top shelf, lying on its side in the dark where wine belongs when it is waiting for its moment. And there it was. On a table in Portland, half empty, being poured into glasses held by people whose names I could not remember, at a celebration I had not been invited to attend. I watched the video 3 times. On the 3rd pass, I slowed my attention the way I used to slow my reading of a blueprint when something in the dimensions did not feel right. And I studied each corner of the frame. At the head of the table, directly opposite Marcus, was a chair. But where a place setting should have been, someone had placed a small arrangement of flowers in a low ceramic vase. No plate, no glass, no napkin. The position was exactly where I would have sat. The patriarch's chair. The seat that belongs to the person at the other end from the host. Everything else on that table had been arranged with intention. The flowers were not an oversight. They were a decision. The caption read, "Grateful for the ones who fill our table and our hearts. This is home." I set the phone face down on the oak table June had chosen at an estate sale in McMinnville the year we moved in. The rain outside had thickened into the kind that fills the gutters and makes the downspouts speak. I sat and looked at the dark window and listened to it and did not move for what might have been 10 minutes or might have been 30. Then I picked the phone back up. Not to watch the video again. I opened my text messages. Not TikTok. I was done with the video. What I needed now was the thing underneath it, the structure that held it up. The way you need the foundation plan when the finished building has started to look wrong. I scrolled to the message Marcus had sent 11 days earlier. November 17th. I had read it at the time without assigning it much weight. The way you read most messages from adult children, as information passing through rather than information landing. It said, "Hey Dad, Tessa and I are doing a small Thanksgiving thing at the house. Low key. Would love to have you. Maybe you could come down Saturday the 30th? We could do a late turkey, keep it casual. Saturday the 30th. The day after Thanksgiving, not Thanksgiving itself." I had read that at the time and thought nothing of it. Marcus worked long hours. Tessa had family in Portland. Scheduling around multiple households was the kind of logistical arithmetic that young couples performed without anyone taking offense. I had replied, "Sounds good. Let me check the weather, and I will let you know." I had not followed up, neither had he. I looked at the timestamp on the video again. November 28th, 6:47 in the evening. Thanksgiving Day. Not the Saturday after. Not the casual, low-key thing he had described. The real dinner had happened on the real day, and I had been offered the leftover version, the one scheduled 2 days later, when the table would already have been cleared, and the bottle would already have been opened, and the caption would already have been written. I set the phone down and picked it up again. I opened my calendar and looked at November 28th. The entry read, OHSU. Cardiology, 11:30, Dr. Rains. Oregon Health and Science University, Portland. I had driven 90 minutes each way for a follow-up on the medication adjustment they had made in September. The appointment had run until nearly 2 in the afternoon. I had stopped at the pharmacy on the first floor, waited 40 minutes for the prescription, and driven home through early darkness on Interstate 5 with the heater running against air that had not yet committed to the temperature the dashboard was promising. At 6:47 that evening, when Marcus posted the video, I had been 40 minutes from home, somewhere south of Salem, on a 2-lane stretch where the cell signal drops to nothing, and the only company is the taillights of a log truck doing 55 in the rain. Marcus knew about the appointment. I had told him. I scrolled back further in the messages and found it. October 14th. I had written, cardiology follow-up at OHSU on the 28th. Gone most of the day. Should be routine, but you know how those waiting rooms are. He had read it. The small indicator beneath the message confirmed it. He had not replied. I sat with that for a moment. Not with anger, not yet. With the particular arithmetic of it. Marcus had known I would be in Portland on November 28th. He had known I would be at a hospital 90 minutes from home for most of the day. He had known the approximate time I would be driving back. And he had scheduled the real Thanksgiving dinner for that evening and invited me to a substitute 2 days later. The dinner was not a spontaneous gathering that happened to fall on a day I was unavailable. It was placed on that day because I was unavailable. The way you place a meeting on someone's calendar when you need the room to yourself. I stood up and took my coffee mug to the sink. It had gone cold sometime around 8. I rinsed it and set it upside down on the drying rack, the way June had always kept hers. Some habits that belong to someone else outlast the person they belong to. You stop noticing you are doing them until a night like this, when noticing is all you have left. Through the window above the sink, the vineyard was invisible now. The rain and the darkness had taken it. But I knew what was out there. The way I knew the layout of this kitchen, without the overhead light. 45 acres, 212 vine rows, each one planted by hand over the course of 3 years. 1998 through 2001, by me and June, and a man named Ernesto Medina, who could read soil the way some people read faces. I thought about the night we opened the first bottle of the 98 Reserve. October of that year, 3 weeks after harvest. We sat on the back porch of this house with 2 glasses and a corkscrew, and the particular silence that falls over a valley when the picking is done and the presses have been cleaned, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the wine to become what it is going to become. June had poured. She always poured. She said I measured things too carefully for wine. That wine needed a hand that trusted the glass to know when it was full. She poured 2 glasses and held hers up to the porch light, a single bulb above the door that turned the wine the color of dark garnet, and she looked at it for a long time without drinking. We did this, she said. Not to me exactly. To the glass. To the valley. To whatever unnamed thing had carried us from a 3-bedroom house in Beaverton and 2 engineering jobs and a savings account that had no business buying 45 acres of unplanted hillside in Yamhill County, all the way to this porch, this glass, this moment. We did, I said. She drank, I drank. The wine was not perfect. It was young and angular and a little too bright on the finish. But it was ours. And that was the only metric June ever used for the things she valued. I stood at the sink in the dark kitchen 26 years later and thought about that porch and that glass and the woman who had poured it. Then I thought about a dining room in Portland where someone had opened the last bottle without asking, without calling, without understanding what was inside it beyond the wine. I dried my hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle. I walked back to the table and sat down and looked at my phone one more time. I was not going to call Marcus. I was not going to send a message. I was not going to do anything tonight that came from the part of me that was still sitting on that porch in 1998, because that part of me would forgive too easily and too quickly, the way it had been forgiving for years. Instead, I was going to wait until Monday morning, and I was going to call a woman whose office smelled like old paper and institutional coffee, whose name was Helen Marsh, and who had never once in 9 years called me to say that everything was fine. I did what I always do when something lands wrong. I went to work. By 6:15 Monday morning, I had the truck running in the driveway, the heater pushing against air that had dropped into the low 30s overnight. The Cascade Range to the east was invisible behind a wall of cloud that sat on the valley like a lid on a pot. December 1st. The vineyard did not care what day of the week it was or what I had seen on a screen 3 nights ago. The vineyard needed what it always needed, and that was the particular comfort of land. It does not adjust its requirements based on your emotional state. I drove the 22 miles to the winery without the radio on. The road between my house and the vineyard runs along the North Fork of the Yamhill River, through country that looks in early December the way it has looked every early December since before anyone thought to plant grapes in it. Green hills gone brown at the edges, bare oaks standing in the fog like people waiting for a bus that is not coming. Fence posts leaning at angles that suggest opinions about the weather. The vines were still when I arrived. 212 rows of Pinot Noir, each one cut back to its winter skeleton. The cordons stripped of leaves and fruit. The trellis wires holding nothing but cold air and the occasional drop of overnight rain. I walked the east block first, the oldest section. The rows June and I had planted by hand in the spring of 1998, with Ernesto Medina crouching beside us, showing us how deep to set the rootstock and how far apart to space the posts. I checked the irrigation controllers at each junction box. I tested the soil moisture with the handheld probe, pushing it into the ground between rows 9 and 10, where drainage had been a problem since 2006. I replaced a broken trellis clip on row 14 and marked 2 posts in the south block that were beginning to lean. The work took until 10:30. My hands knew every step of it without instruction from anywhere else. While I worked, I thought about money, not in the abstract way a person thinks about money when they are worried about having enough, but in the specific way an engineer thinks about load distribution, which piece is carrying which weight, and whether the structure it supports was honestly represented at the time the load was applied. In October of 2019, Marcus had called on a Sunday afternoon. He was 29 years old, working in tech consulting in Portland, not yet married to Tessa. He said he had been looking into our tax situation, his word, our, as though the vineyard's finances were a shared concern rather than mine alone, and suggested that adding his name to the property deed would simplify the estate planning and reduce the tax burden when the time came for a transfer. He used the phrase "just a paperwork thing." He said it would make the accountant's job easier. He said it was standard. I signed. I signed because he was my son, and because the request sounded reasonable, and because I was 2 years into grief and not yet in the practice of examining the architecture of the things people asked me to do. In March of 2022, 14 months after Tessa became his wife, Marcus called again. He and Tessa needed $55,000. A bridge loan, he said, to cover a gap between a contractor's invoice and a reimbursement from Tessa's firm. Something about their Portland townhouse renovation, plumbing and structural work that could not wait. He said, "Just temporary, Dad. 60 days at most." I wired the money. $38,000 had been repaid over the following year in irregular installments. The remaining $17,000 had not been mentioned since. That same year, Marcus asked me to co-sign a small business line of credit for Tessa's consulting practice. He said my clean financial record would strengthen the application. He said it was just a formality. Just. That word had appeared in every request Marcus had made in the past 5 years. Just paperwork. Just temporary. Just a formality. It was a small word that did a great deal of structural work. The kind of word that makes a load-bearing request sound like something cosmetic. June had seen something in Marcus before I had. Not suspicion exactly. Observation. In the summer of 2018, 2 years before Tessa, June and I were sitting on the back porch after dinner. Marcus had called that afternoon asking whether we had ever considered hiring a management company to handle the vineyard operations, to free us up, as he put it. June had listened on speaker and said the right things, and waited until the call ended. Then she looked at the vineyard for a while and said, "He has your patience, but not your roots, Walt. He can wait for things, but he does not know what he is waiting for." I had not understood what she meant at the time. I was beginning to understand it now. I finished the vineyard work at 10:30, washed my hands at the spigot by the equipment shed, and drove to McMinnville. Helen Marsh's office was on the second floor of a brick building on 3rd Street. Up a set of stairs that creaked in the same places they had creaked the first time I climbed them 9 years ago. The building smelled like old paper and the particular kind of coffee that means someone has been working seriously in a small room for a long time. Helen was a compact woman in her middle 50s, with reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck and a habit of writing everything down by hand on a yellow legal pad. She did not use a laptop during client meetings. She did not take calls. She sat across a wooden desk that was older than either of us, and she listened. That was how you knew she was serious. I sat down across from her at 10:45, and she picked up her pen and pulled the legal pad to the center of the desk and looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of a person who has made a career of hearing things that other people have been carrying alone for too long. "Tell me everything," she said. From the beginning, I told it the way I would have described a structural problem to a building inspector. In sequence. Without editorializing. The facts first, then the pattern, then the question the pattern raised. I started with the video. The lighting that was too even for a kitchen fixture. The table arranged with the precision of someone who understood how a frame would read on a screen. The bottle. I told Helen what the 1998 reserve was and what it meant and what June had made me promise about it, and I watched her write all of it down without changing expression. I told her about the flowers in the ceramic vase where my plate should have been. I told her about the caption. She wrote that down too. Then I told her about the text message. November 17th. Marcus inviting me for the Saturday, after Thanksgiving, not the day itself. I told her about the cardiology appointment at OHSU on the 28th. The message I had sent Marcus on October 14th, informing him of the date. The read receipt confirming he had seen it, and the fact that at 6:47 on Thanksgiving evening, when the video was posted, I had been driving south on Interstate 5 in the dark with a pharmacy bag on the passenger seat and no knowledge that a dinner was happening at all. Helen did not interrupt. She filled 2 pages of the legal pad in her small, unhurried handwriting, the kind that looks like it was designed to be read by someone decades from now who would need to understand exactly what had been said and in what order. When I finished with the video, I moved to the financial history. I told it chronologically. The co-ownership arrangement in October of 2019, Marcus's phone call on a Sunday afternoon. The language he had used, the phrase, "just a paperwork thing," the explanation about simplifying estate planning and reducing tax burden. I told her I had signed without consulting an attorney, which was the kind of admission that cost nothing to make in front of the right person and everything to make in front of the wrong one. Helen was the right person. I told her about the $55,000 in March of 2022. The bridge loan for the Portland townhouse renovation. $38,000 repaid. $17,000 outstanding and unmentioned. I told her about the co-sign on Tessa's business line of credit that same year. My clean financial record used to strengthen someone else's application for money I would never see. Helen wrote without comment. When I finished, she set her pen down on the legal pad, which in 9 years of working with her, I had learned to recognize as the equivalent of another person standing up from the table. It meant the listening phase was over and the thinking phase had begun. She asked 3 questions. Current appraised value of the vineyard, $1.8 million, I said. County reassessed in April, after the rezoning along the new highway corridor through Yamhill County. The house, $350,000. Same assessment cycle. Does Marcus know those figures? I never told him. She picked her pen back up and tapped it twice against the legal pad. She did this when something interested her, in a way that had professional implications rather than personal ones. That is what I would like to find out, she said. She explained what she proposed. First, a comprehensive investigation. She would run my name through civil registries in every state, do a full title search on both properties, and pull any commercial credit records associated with my Social Security number. She wanted to see whether anything had been filed, recorded, or attached to my name that I had not authorized or been informed of. Second, depending on what the search produced, she recommended an irrevocable living trust. She explained the structure in the way she explained most legal concepts, precisely and without condescension. An irrevocable trust transfers ownership of assets while the grantor is still alive. Unlike a will, which takes effect after death and must pass through probate, a trust takes effect the moment it is executed and funded. No court involvement. No waiting period. No requirement to notify anyone who had been informally expecting to inherit. Once funded, she said, the arrangement is permanent. It cannot be revoked or altered by anyone other than the grantor, and only while the grantor is living. A challenge would require demonstrating either undue influence or lack of mental capacity, neither of which applied to a 62-year-old man with a documented financial history, a specific legal request, and a licensed attorney present at the execution. Give me a week, she said. I will call when I have something. I asked one more question before I stood up. June came to see you, I said. Before she died. Helen's pen stopped moving. She looked at me over her reading glasses. In 9 years, I had seen Helen react to very few things. This was one of them. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. The look of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has just been told the holder may soon be ready to receive it. She did, Helen said. She gave you something. She did. Is now the right time? Helen considered this for a moment. Not yet, she said. But soon. Let me do the search first. What she left you will mean more when you can see the full picture. I did not press. June had trusted Helen. That was enough for now. I stood, pulled on my jacket, and walked down the creaking stairs onto 3rd Street. The December air was cold and damp, the kind that gets into the lining of your coat before you reach the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, looking at the brick storefronts of McMinnville in the flat gray light of a Monday afternoon in early winter. I had set something in motion that could not be taken back. Not because Helen had said anything dramatic, but because she had not. In 9 years of working with the woman, I had learned that her silences carried more weight than most people's arguments. And when she had said not yet, but soon about whatever June had left, she had said it with the quiet certainty of a person who has already seen how this ends and is simply waiting for the rest of us to arrive. I drove back toward the vineyard with the heater running high. Helen would call when she had something. She always did. And it had never once been to tell me that everything was fine. Helen called on Thursday evening. She said 4 words before I could say anything. Come in tomorrow morning. I had heard that tone from her exactly twice before in 9 years. The first was when she discovered a filing error in the original deed transfer for the vineyard that could have cost me 6 months of legal proceedings if it had not been caught. The second was the afternoon she called to tell me that June had come to see her 3 weeks before June died and had left something in her keeping. Both times, the tone had been the same. Not alarm. Precision. The particular sound of a person who has found something that requires the other person to be sitting down and looking at it directly. I was at her office before 9. The stairs creaked in the same places. The hallway smelled the same. Helen's door was open. She was already seated behind the desk, with 2 folders arranged in front of her. One thin, one thicker, both positioned in the center of the surface, the way you position something you want. A person to have no choice but to look at. She did not offer coffee. That was how I knew. Walk me through the financial requests again, she said. All of them. In order. I did. It took less time than the first telling because I had already stripped it down to its components. The co-ownership in 2019. The $55,000 in 2022. The cosign. Helen opened the thin folder. The first document was a bank routing record. She turned it so I could read it and placed her pen tip on a line item dated March 22, 2022. The wire transfer, $55,000, sent from my account to what Marcus had described as their joint household account for the Portland renovation. The money had arrived in that account and remained there for exactly 4 days. On March 26th, $47,000 had been transferred out to an entity called Cole Strategic Consulting LLC. Registered in Oregon. Managing member, Tessa Cole Brennan. Secondary member, Marcus Brennan. I looked at the name. Cole was Tessa's maiden name. They used my money to fund her company, I said. 47,000 of the 55, Helen said. The remaining $8,000 stayed in their joint account and was used for miscellaneous household expenses over the following 3 months. Of the $47,000 that went into the LLC, $38,000 was eventually returned to you in irregular payments over the next year. The remaining $17,000 was absorbed into the LLC's operating costs and has not been accounted for. She let me sit with that. Helen understood the difference between giving someone information and giving someone time to process it. She had never confused the two. The renovation, I said. There was no renovation, Helen said. I checked the Portland building permit records for their address. No permits were filed in 2022. No contractor invoices. No inspection requests. The townhouse has not had any permitted structural or plumbing work done since 2020, which was 2 years before they asked you for the money. I thought about the Sunday afternoon phone call. Marcus's voice, relaxed and warm. The sound of a person who has already decided what he is going to ask for and is running a warm-up lap before asking it. Just temporary, Dad. 60 days at most. 60 days. The money had left my account and entered his wife's LLC within 4. Helen turned to the second document in the thin folder. This one I had to read twice. It was a record of a phone call logged by Phil Langford's office. Phil had been my accountant for 10 years. He handled the quarterly filings for the vineyard, the depreciation schedules, the seasonal labor records, the equipment costs. I had trusted him the way you trust someone who has handled your numbers long enough that you stop checking their work, which is an entirely different thing from having a reason to trust them. On January 11th, 2023, Tessa had called Phil's office. The call was logged as a family financial consultation, a phrase that sounded professional enough to justify its existence in a billing record, but vague enough to cover almost anything. The call lasted 32 minutes. Helen slid a printed email across the desk. It was from Phil to Tessa, sent the same day, 2 hours after the phone call. The subject line read, Brennan Vineyard, Current Assessment Summary. The body of the email contained a single paragraph and 3 numbers. The paragraph read, Happy to help the family get a clear picture of the estate's current position. Please find the figures below. The 3 numbers were the appraised value of the vineyard, the appraised value of the house, and the combined total, $1.8 million, $350,000, $2.15 million. My numbers. From my file, given to my daughter-in-law without my knowledge, without my consent, in a phone call logged under a phrase designed to make it sound routine. Phil is a licensed CPA, Helen said. Sharing a client's financial assessment with a third party, without the client's knowledge or consent, is a violation of the American Institute of CPAs' Code of Professional Conduct, Section 1.700. Whether Phil understood he was crossing that line is a separate question. I suspect he did not. He probably thought of it as helping the family. He was helping the family, I said. Just not mine. I sat with the 2 documents for a moment. The routing record and the email. $47,000 moving silently from my account into an LLC I had never heard of. And 10 months later, the full financial picture of my estate moving silently from my accountant's files into the hands of the person who had received the money. Each transaction had been framed in language, designed to make it feel minor. Just a bridge loan. Just a family consultation. Just helping. I was beginning to understand that the word just, when used by people who are taking something from you, functions the same way a drop cloth functions on a construction site. It covers the mess so you do not see it while it is being made. Helen closed the thin folder and opened the second one. It was thicker. She positioned it in the center of the desk and looked at me with the particular expression I had seen only a handful of times in 9 years, the expression that meant the thin folder had been the introduction. This part, she said without looking up, is why I called you last night instead of waiting until this morning. Before I reveal what Helen found inside that second folder, the document that finally showed me what Marcus had been building toward all along, drop the number 6 in the comments so I know you are still here with me. Because what comes next is the piece that made everything else fall into place. A note. This story contains fictional elements shaped for reflection and understanding. If that is not what you came for, this is a good moment to step away, and we respect that completely. Helen turned her laptop around to face me. On the screen was an email chain. 12 messages long, running from early August through mid-September of this year. The sender on the first message was Marcus Brennan. The recipient was an address at Cascade Hospitality Group, Portland, Oregon. I had never heard that name in my life. Helen said nothing. She let me read from the beginning, the way she always did when she believed the documents could speak more clearly than she could. The first email was dated August 9th. The subject line was blank. The body read, "Asset is a 45-acre working vineyard and winery operation outside McMinnville, Oregon, Willamette Valley, AVA. Current owner is 62. In reasonable health. No other direct heirs on record. Estimated timeline to availability, 18 to 24 months. Interested in discussing terms for a boutique hospitality conversion once ownership structure is consolidated. Happy to provide additional details at your convenience." I read it once. Then I read it again, slower. The way you reread a measurement when the number does not match the space it is supposed to fit. 18 to 24 months. That was how long Marcus estimated it would take for the vineyard to become available. Available. The word a person uses for a hotel room or a parking space. Not for 45 acres of land that two people spent 26 years pressing their lives into. Cascade had replied within 3 business days. They were interested. Their preliminary assessment, based on Yamhill County assessor records and comparable sales along the new highway corridor, placed the property's value at approximately $2.3 million, a figure that included the land, the existing winery infrastructure, and the brand potential of an established Willamette Valley operation. They were prepared to move quickly once title was clear and the transfer could be executed without complication. I kept reading. There were 4 more exchanges about logistics, the type of vineyard operation, and how it would affect the conversion timeline. Whether there were existing lease agreements on the land, what the water rights situation looked like, the zoning implications of converting agricultural land to mixed commercial and hospitality use. All of it was written in the measured language of people who have done this kind of transaction many times and have developed a vocabulary for moving through it without leaving fingerprints. Then came the September email. Marcus to Cascade. September 3rd. Working on consolidating ownership structure. Should allow us to accelerate the timeline somewhat. We'll keep you updated as this develops. Consolidating ownership structure. I sat with that phrase, the way I used to sit with a set of plans that had a load-bearing error buried somewhere in the middle of them. The words were clean and professional. The thing they described was not. "How did you find these?" I asked. "I did not find the emails," Helen said. "I found a notice of prospective interest filed by Cascade Hospitality Group in Yamhill County's public property records. Standard practice for commercial developers who want to protect a future transaction they have agreed to in principle. It appeared during the title search on the vineyard parcel. And Cascade gave you the emails. When I identified myself as counsel for Walter Brennan and confirmed that you are the titled owner of the property in question, they understood immediately that Marcus had no authority to negotiate on behalf of the estate. They cooperated fully. In their position, they would want the actual owner involved before any deal moved forward. I looked at the September email again. Consolidating ownership structure. 5 words that translated into something very specific. Marcus already had his name on the deed. He had placed it there in 2019. 5 years before this email was written. What he was consolidating was not ownership. It was control. Helen let me sit with it. She had the particular patience of someone who has watched many people arrive at conclusions they did not want to reach, and has learned that the arriving cannot be rushed. "The letter of intent," I said. She scrolled down. There it was. Dated August 22nd of this year. Marcus Brennan on one side, Cascade Hospitality Group on the other. A non-binding agreement to proceed with the acquisition and conversion of the vineyard property, subject to clear title and a completed ownership transfer. Marcus had signed it. His signature was the same one I had watched him practice at the kitchen table when he was 14 years old, sitting across from June, who had told him a signature should look like it belongs to someone who means what he is writing. He had used that signature to begin selling the land his mother had loved more than any room she had ever stood in. "There is more," Helen said. I looked at her. In 9 years, Helen had delivered a great deal of information across that desk. Tax complications, filing errors, easement disputes, the particular legal tangles that accumulate around rural property, like weather around a mountain. She had delivered all of it with the same measured calm. But in this moment, there was something in the way she held her pen, not writing, just holding, that told me the next piece was different. "Show me," I said. Helen scrolled to a new document on the laptop screen. It was a legal research memo, the kind an attorney prepares when they are investigating a specific procedural avenue. The header read, Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 105, Partition of Property. The document had not been prepared by Helen. It had been prepared by an attorney in Portland whose name I did not recognize, and it had been found in a file associated with Tessa's Consulting LLC during the title search. "Partition action," Helen said. "It is a legal process by which any co-owner of a property can petition a court to either physically divide the property or, more commonly, force a sale. If Marcus were to file a partition action against you as the other co-owner, the court would likely order the vineyard sold at auction because agricultural land cannot be meaningfully divided into separate functional parcels. Cascade would be positioned to purchase at a price they have already agreed to in principle." I sat with that. The mechanics of it were clean. Marcus had his name on the deed. As a co-owner, he had the legal standing to force a sale whether I agreed to it or not. It would take time. There would be hearings and filings and the particular slow grinding of a legal process designed to be exhausting. But the outcome, once initiated, was almost certain. A 45-acre vineyard cannot be split down the middle and operated as two 22-acre vineyards by two people who are not speaking to each other. The court would order a sale. Cascade would buy. The vines June and I planted by hand in 1998 would become the landscaping for a boutique resort where people would drink wine without knowing or caring whose hands had been in the soil. "The 55,000, I said. "That was part of it too." Helen nodded. "The credit notation created by the cosign and the LLC transfer creates a flag on your commercial record. It does not place a direct lien on the vineyard, but it complicates any clean title transfer. If you attempted to move the property into a trust without first clearing the notation, a title company would flag it and require documentation and explanation before proceeding. It would slow things down. In a partition scenario, that delay works in Marcus's favor because it gives his attorneys time to file before you can secure the asset. Every piece connected. The co-ownership for access. The money for leverage. The credit notation for friction. The cascade emails for a buyer. The partition research for an exit. Each one presented to me as something small, something routine, something just. Helen closed the laptop and folded her hands on the desk. "There is one more thing you need to understand," she said. "And this is the part I need you to hear carefully." She opened the thick folder to its last page. It was a county filing record from the Yamhill County Clerk's office. The document recorded the date on which Marcus Brennan's name had been added to the deed of the vineyard property. I already knew the date, October of 2019. I had signed the papers myself, but Helen was not pointing at the date. She was pointing at the timeline. "Marcus met Tessa Cole in March of 2020, she said. They began dating in April. They married in June of 2022. She looked at me over her reading glasses. He put his name on the deed in October of 2019, 6 months before he met her. The office was quiet. The building's old heating system made a sound somewhere behind the walls, the low mechanical hum of something working to keep a space warm that was not designed to hold this kind of cold. I looked at the filing date on the document. October 14th, 2019. I looked at the date Helen had written on her legal pad. March 2020. 6 months. This was his idea, I said. Helen did not answer. She did not need to. I sat in the chair across from her desk and did the arithmetic I should have done 5 years ago. Marcus had called me on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2019, 3 years before Tessa, 3 years before the LLC, 3 years before Cascade, and asked me to put his name on the deed. He had used the words "just a paperwork thing." He had talked about tax efficiency and estate simplification. He had sounded like a son who was thinking about his father's future. He had been thinking about the land, not about me, not about June, not about the 26 years of labor and love and weather that had been pressed into those 45 acres. About the number, the $1.8 million number that he did not yet know precisely, but had apparently estimated closely enough to act on. Tessa had not created this. Tessa had refined it. She had brought the financial architecture, the LLC, the credit notation, the Cascade connection, the partition research, but the foundation, the original decision to attach his name to my property under a false premise, that had been Marcus alone, my son, before anyone else had entered the picture. I thought about June sitting on the porch in 2018, watching the vineyard in the last September light, saying, "He has your patience, but not your roots." She had seen it. She had seen something moving in him that I had not wanted to see, and she had said it the only way she knew how. In a sentence that sounded like observation but was actually a warning, I looked at Helen. "What do we do about the co-ownership?" She picked up her pen. "The deed was obtained through fraud in the inducement. Marcus represented to you that the purpose was tax simplification. The evidence demonstrates that the actual purpose was to establish a legal Ismarquarter. Is my legal position from which to eventually force a sale or claim a financial interest in the property. I can file to have his name removed on that basis." "How long?" "Filing to removal, assuming no contest, approximately 3 to 4 weeks. And if he contests, he would need to demonstrate that his stated reason for requesting co-ownership was genuine. Given the Cascade emails, the LLC transfers, and the partition research, that argument would not survive a preliminary hearing." I nodded once. Helen wrote something on the legal pad. Then she set her pen down, opened the center drawer of her desk, and placed a small box on the surface between us. It was not a legal document. It was not a filing. It was a box, slightly larger than a deck of cards, made of something that looked like it had been handled carefully for a long time. Inside it, I could see the edge of a plastic case, the kind that holds a cassette tape. "June brought this to me on February 2nd, 2021, Helen said. 5 weeks before she passed. She asked me to hold it and to give it to you when you truly needed it." Helen looked at me. Those were her words. Truly needed. I drove home from Helen's office that Friday afternoon with the windows down despite the cold. The vineyard road was quiet, the vines stripped bare against a pewter sky, and I needed the air to feel like something real against my face. The file folder Helen had given me sat on the passenger seat, thick as a hymnal. I did not open it again. I had read every page twice in her office, and once more in the parking lot, and the words had not changed. They were not going to change. When I pulled into the gravel drive, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. The porch light was on a timer June had set in 2019, and it clicked on as I stepped out of the truck, the way it always did. Like someone inside was expecting me. No one was inside. No one had been inside waiting for me in 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. But the lights still came on. I fed the dog. I made coffee, even though it was late for coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the mug between my hands and stared at the folder and thought about what Helen had said just before I left. She had closed the Cascade file and placed it back in her drawer. Then she opened a different drawer, a smaller one on the left side of her desk, and took out a padded envelope. It was manila. 6 by 9 inches, sealed with clear packing tape that had yellowed slightly along the edges. On the front, in handwriting I would have recognized from across a football field, it said, "For Helen. To keep. Until it matters." June's handwriting. The tall loops on the H. The slight forward lean. She never corrected because she said upright letters looked like they had no place to go. Helen placed the envelope on the desk between us and rested her fingers on top of it. She told me June had brought it to her office on March 14th, 2021. That was a Sunday. Helen said she remembered because she does not usually work Sundays, but June had called the Friday before and asked if she could come by, and something in her voice made Helen say yes. June was already sick by then. She had been diagnosed the previous November, and by March the treatments had moved from the word hopeful to the word comfortable, which is not the same word at all. Helen said June sat in the same chair I had been sitting in, and handed her the envelope, and said only one thing. She said, "He is going to need this, but not yet." Helen told me she had kept it in that drawer for 3 years. She had not opened it. She had not held it up to the light. She said she had thought about it more than a few times, especially in the first year after June passed. But she had made a promise, and Helen Marsh is the kind of person who keeps promises even when the person who asked is no longer there to check. I asked her what was inside. She said she did not know for certain, but based on the shape and weight, she believed it was a cassette tape. A cassette tape. I almost smiled. June had never trusted digital anything. She paid bills by check until 2020. She kept recipes on index cards. She recorded voice memos on a small silver Sony recorder she had bought at a Radio Shack in McMinnville in 2003, the kind that used standard cassettes, 60 minutes per side. She used it for everything. Garden notes, harvest reminders, messages to herself about what to plant, where and when to turn the soil. I had found 11 tapes in a shoebox in the closet after she died, all labeled in her handwriting. Rose's East Bed, February. Pinot Block 4, September. Mateo, birthday song. I had listened to every one of them on the same recorder, sitting on the bedroom floor with the door closed, and each one had made me feel like she was standing just behind me, close enough that if I turned fast enough I might catch her. But I had not found a 12th tape. I had not known there was one. Helen asked me if I wanted to take it home. I told her yes. She slid it across the desk, and I picked it up and held it, and felt the slight rattle of the cassette inside the padding. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. I did not open it in the car. I did not open it when I got home. I set it on the kitchen table next to the coffee mug and the file folder, and I sat there in the light of the timer lamp and I looked at it. June had recorded something 3 years ago, when she was sick, when she knew she was not going to get better. And she had driven to Helen's office on a Sunday and asked her to keep it until it mattered. She had not given it to me. She had not left it in the shoebox with the others. She had taken it to a lawyer. That meant she knew. Not the details. Not the cascade emails, or the LLC, or the wire transfers. She did not have those. But she knew something. She knew Marcus in a way that I, his father, had not allowed myself to know him. She had seen whatever it was I had been looking away from for years. And she had not told me, because telling me would have meant making me choose between my son and the truth, and June had loved me too much to put that choice in front of me while she was still alive. So she put it in an envelope, and she gave it to a woman she trusted, and she said, "He is going to need this, but not yet." I sat at that table until the coffee went cold. The dog lay under my chair with his chin on my boot. Outside the timer light held steady against the dark, and the vineyard was quiet. And somewhere in that yellow envelope my wife was waiting to tell me something she had carried alone. I was not ready. But I was closer than I had been yesterday. I left the envelope on the table and went to bed. I did not sleep well. I dreamed of June standing in row 47, the oldest row, holding the silver recorder to her lips, and when I called out to her, she turned and smiled but did not stop talking, and I could not hear what she was saying because the wind was moving through the canopy and the leaves were louder than her voice. I woke at 5:11. The envelope was still on the table. The light was still on. I made coffee. I sat down. And this time, I reached for it. The tape was inside the envelope just as Helen had guessed. A standard 60-minute Maxell, the kind June bought in packs of 5 from the office supply store in Newburgh. She had written on the label in blue ink. It said, Walt, December. Not a date, not a year. Just my name and a month. I turned it over in my hands. The plastic was cool and unremarkable. It could have been garden notes, but June had not put this one in the shoebox with the others. She had driven it to a lawyer on a Sunday in March, 5 weeks before the hospice bed arrived in our living room. I went to the bedroom closet and found the Sony recorder on the top shelf, behind a box of June's winter scarves I had not moved. The batteries were dead. I found 2 AA batteries in the junk drawer, the drawer June used to call the everything drawer, because she said junk was not a word that belonged in a house. I loaded them and put the tape inside and set the recorder on the kitchen table between my coffee mug and the file folder. I pressed play. There was a hiss. 5 seconds. 8. Then her voice. Hi, sweetheart. It is March 14th, 2021. A Sunday. I am sitting in the kitchen because the light is best here in the morning, and I want you to hear me clearly. I stopped breathing. My lungs locked and my hands went flat on the table, and I held still the way you hold still when a deer steps out of the tree line and you do not want to scare it back into the dark. She sounded tired, but like herself. She sounded like June. I am recording this because there are things I need to say to you that I cannot say to your face. Not because I do not trust you, because I trust you too much. If I told you while sitting across from you, you would try to fix them, and some things cannot be fixed while the people involved are still watching. She paused. I heard her shift in the chair. The same chair I was sitting in. This is about Marcus. I have watched him carefully for the last 2 years. Since around the time he asked you to put his name on the deed, you said it was reasonable. You said he was our son and the vineyard would be his eventually. I did not argue because I did not have proof. I only had a feeling. And you have always told me that feelings are not evidence. She was right. I had said that. It was something my father used to say, and I had carried it forward, without examining whether it was true. But I am going to tell you my feeling anyway, because I am running out of time to be wrong. Another pause. I heard her swallow. I believe Marcus does not see the vineyard the way we see it. He does not see 45 acres of Pinot Noir that we planted row by row with Ernesto in the rain. He does not see the barn we rebuilt after the ice storm of 2006 or the well we drilled in 2009. He sees a number. I do not know what the number is, but I know he has been looking at it. Because he talks about the property now. He used to say the vineyard, or the farm, or home. Now he says the property, and I do not think he hears the difference, but I do. I paused the tape. I walked to the window and looked out at row 47. The oldest row. The one June and Ernesto had planted in November of 1998, while I was still working my engineering job in Portland, driving down on weekends with my hands smelling like copier toner. I sat back down and pressed play. I also believe Tessa is involved. I like Tessa, in many ways. She is smart, and she makes Marcus feel important, which he has always needed. But she looks at this place the way a contractor looks at a house. She sees potential, not history. She asked me once during a visit in 2019 what the vineyard would appraise for if we ever decided to sell. I told her we were not selling, and she laughed and said, "Of course not. But people who are just curious do not write down the answer on their phone when they think you are not looking." June had seen that. I had not. Or I had seen it and filed it under the category of things that are probably nothing, which is where uncomfortable truths go to hide. Her voice softened. I could hear her leaning closer to the recorder. Here is what I want you to do. Protect the vineyard. Not for Marcus. Not against Marcus. For the land itself. For Ernesto, who gave 30 years of his life to this soil. For Rosa, who grew up between these rows and learned to walk holding onto a vine stake. For Mateo, who will not remember me, but who deserves to stand where I stood and know that someone loved this place enough to keep it whole. She took a long breath, the kind you take when you are about to say the last thing. And for you, Walt, protect it for you, because you are the kind of man who will give everything away to keep the peace. And I love that about you. But peace is not the same as justice, and sometimes the people we love the most are the ones we need to protect things from. The tape hissed for a moment. Then one more thing. The 1998 Reserve. There is one bottle left. Do not let anyone open it. Open it when you are ready. You will know when. The recorder clicked. Side 1 had ended. I did not flip it. June always recorded on side 1 only. She said side 2 was for emergencies, and she never had an emergency worth recording. I sat at the table for a long time. The coffee was cold. The dog had moved to the rug by the door, watching me the way dogs watch when they know something has changed, but do not know what. June had known. Not the wire transfers or the LLC or the emails to Cascade, but she had seen the current before the river changed course. And she had done the only thing she could do from where she was standing. She had left me her voice. I rewound the tape and pressed play again. This time, I did not pause. I listened to the tape 4 times that morning. By the 4th listen, I had stopped hearing it with my chest and started hearing it with my head. June had given me the why. Helen had given me the how. What I needed now was the when. I called Helen at 8:15. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. I said I listened to it. She said I know. I said I want to move forward. She said come in at 10. The drive to McMinnville took 34 minutes that morning because a logging truck had jackknifed near the Dundee Junction and traffic was backed up past the gas station where June used to buy sunflower seeds for the birds. I sat in the truck with the engine idling and the heater blowing, and I thought about what June had said. Peace is not the same as justice. I had spent 62 years believing they were close enough to be interchangeable. She had spent her last months knowing they were not. Helen's office smelled like fresh paper and old wood. She had 2 documents on her desk, each in a blue legal binder. She offered me coffee, and I took it even though I had already had 3 cups. She sat down and placed her reading glasses on top of her head, the way she always did when she wanted to talk before she wanted to read. She said the first thing we need to do is remove Marcus from the deed. She explained that because the co-ownership was added in 2019 as a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, Marcus currently had a legal claim to the property upon my death. But because the original purchase in 1998 was solely in my name, and because the addition of Marcus's name was done without independent legal counsel or consideration, meaning Marcus paid nothing for the interest, it could be challenged. However, she did not recommend a challenge. Challenges take time, and courts, and money, and attention. And attention was the one thing she did not want Marcus to have right now. Instead, she recommended a voluntary transfer. She would draft a quitclaim deed for Marcus to sign, relinquishing his interest in the property. She said the question was whether Marcus would sign it. I told her he would if he did not know what came after. Helen looked at me over her glasses and said that is exactly what I was thinking. The second document was the trust. Helen explained it carefully, the way she explained everything, without rushing and without assuming I already understood. She said an irrevocable living trust would remove the vineyard and the house from my personal estate and place them under a separate legal entity managed by a trustee. Once established, I could not reverse it, sell the property, or change the beneficiary without the trustee's consent. That was the point. It was a lock, and I was handing someone else the key. I asked who the trustee would be. She said she recommended a professional fiduciary, someone with no personal connection to the family. She had worked with a firm in Salem called Evergreen Trust Services, and they had a strong record. The annual fee was $1,800. I told her that was fine. Then she asked the harder question. She said, "Who is the beneficiary?" I did not hesitate. I said, "Rosa Medina." Helen wrote the name down. She asked me to explain my reasoning, not because she disagreed, but because the trust document would need a statement of intent, and she wanted the language to come from me. I told her that Ernesto Medina had worked the vineyard for 23 years, from 1998 until his death in August of 2021, 4 months after June. He had planted every row in the East Block. He had grafted the Pinot Noir clones that now produced our best fruit. He had repaired the irrigation system 6 times without ever sending me a bill for parts. He had taught me more about soil and light and patience than any book I ever read. And I had read many. I told her that Rosa had grown up on the vineyard. She had learned to walk between the rows. She had worked harvests from the age of 12, not because I asked, but because she wanted to be near her father. She had gone to Oregon State, studied viticulture and enology, become a sommelier, and worked at 3 of the best wineries in the valley before taking a position at a restaurant in Portland. She understood the land. She understood the wine. She understood what it meant to care for something not because it was profitable but because it was alive. And I told her about Mateo, 5 years old, Ernesto's grandson, Rosa's son, a boy who called me Mr. Walt, and who had once stood in the middle of row 12 during a September harvest and said the grapes smelled like his grandfather's hands. Helen wrote for a long time. When she finished, she read the statement of intent back to me. It said that the trust was established to preserve the agricultural character and family heritage of the vineyard property, and that the grantor, Walter James Brennan, designated Rosa Elena Medina as sole beneficiary in recognition of the Medina family's 23-year stewardship and the shared vision of the grantor and his late wife, June Adele Brennan, that the land remain a working vineyard in perpetuity. I told her that was right. She said she would need 7 to 10 business days to finalize the documents, coordinate with Evergreen Trust Services, and prepare the quitclaim deed. She said she also wanted to run a final title search to confirm there were no additional encumbrances. I told her to take whatever time she needed. Then she asked about the dinner. I had not mentioned a dinner. She looked at me and said, "Walt, I have known you for 14 years. You are not the kind of man who protects something quietly. You are the kind of man who sets the table first." She was right. I had been thinking about it since the morning I watched the video. Not a confrontation. Not a scene. A dinner. At the farmhouse. On Christmas Eve. The way June used to do it. The long table in the dining room. The good plates. The candles she kept in the sideboard drawer. I wanted every person who mattered in that room at the same time. And I wanted the truth served alongside the pot roast. Helen said she could have everything ready by December 23rd. I said that would be fine. I drove home with the windows up this time. The logging truck was gone. The road was clear. The vineyard came into view as I crested the hill on the county road. The bare vines in their rows like sentences written in a language I had spent 26 years learning to read. June had planted the first word. Ernesto had planted the second, and now it was my turn to decide how the paragraph ended. I had 11 days. The next morning I started making phone calls. Not the kind Marcus made. Quiet and strategic, and aimed at people who could give him something. Mine were simple. I called the people I wanted at my table, and I asked them to come. Frank Bowen was first. I called him at 7:30 because Frank has been awake since 5 every morning for 40 years. And considers anyone who calls after 8 to be running late. He picked up and said, "What is wrong?" Because Frank does not believe in phone calls that begin with hello. I told him I was having a Christmas Eve dinner at the farmhouse, and I wanted him there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is about time. Walt." He did not ask who else was coming. He did not ask what I was planning. He said, "What do you want me to bring?" And I said, "Just yourself." And he said, "I will bring pie anyway." And that was the end of it. 41 years of friendship in under 2 minutes. Pastor David Klein was next. I had not spoken to David in almost 5 months, not because of any disagreement, but because I had stopped going to church after June's memorial service, and never explained why. David had called twice and left messages that were kind without being insistent, which is a rare skill in a pastor. I called him and said, "I owe you an explanation." He said, "You do not owe me anything, but I would like to hear one if you want to give it." I told him about the dinner. I told him I needed a witness. Not a legal witness, a moral one. Someone whose presence in the room would remind everyone, including me, that the truth matters even when it is uncomfortable. David said, "I will be there." Then he said, "Walt, are you all right?" I said, "I am getting there." The third call was the hardest. I called Rosa. She answered on the fourth ring. I could hear Mateo in the background singing something in Spanish, a song Ernesto used to sing in the vineyard during harvest, and for a moment I could not speak, because the melody came through the phone like a hand reaching across 3 years of absence. Rosa said, "Mr. Walt, is everything okay?" I said, "Everything is fine." I said, "I am having a dinner on Christmas Eve, and I would like you and Mateo to be there." She was quiet. Rosa is not a woman who fills silence with noise. She learned that from Ernesto, who could work an entire afternoon beside you without saying a word and still make you feel like you had the best conversation of your life. After a moment she said, "We would love that." Then she said, "Is Marcus going to be there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay. Just okay." But I heard the weight in it. Rosa and Marcus had never been close. When they were younger, it was simply distance. Marcus in Portland and Rosa on the vineyard. Two orbits that did not intersect. But after Ernesto died, something shifted. Rosa had called Marcus once to ask about a piece of equipment her father had stored in the barn. A grafting bench Ernesto had built by hand in 2004. Marcus told her he would look into it. He never called back. 2 months later, Rosa drove down to the vineyard and found the bench had been moved to the equipment shed, half buried under tarps and feed bags. She carried it to her truck alone. She never asked Marcus for anything again. I did not tell Rosa about the trust. I did not tell her about the cassette or the cascade emails or the quitclaim deed. That would come later. For now, I only needed her to say yes, and she had. The fourth call was to Marcus. I planned it carefully. I waited until Wednesday evening, December 11th, because Helen had told me the quitclaim deed would be ready by the 18th, and I wanted Marcus committed to the dinner before any legal documents arrived. I called at 6:45. A time I knew Marcus would be home from work but not yet settled into whatever evening routine he and Tessa had built in their Portland townhouse. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Dad," he said. And his voice was the same voice it had always been, warm and easy and slightly distracted. The voice of a man who has learned to sound present without actually being present. I told him I was having a Christmas Eve dinner at the farmhouse. A real one. The way your mother used to do it. The long table. The good plates. The candles. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "That sounds great, Dad. Really great." He asked who was coming. I said Frank. David Klein. Rosa and Mateo. He paused again. Longer this time. He said Rosa. I said yes. He said okay. Sure. The more the merrier. I heard Tessa's voice in the background, muffled, asking who was on the phone. Marcus covered the receiver, but not well enough. I heard him say, "My dad. Christmas Eve dinner. The farm." I heard Tessa say something I could not make out. And then Marcus came back and said, "We will be there, Dad. Tessa says she is looking forward to it." I said, "Good." I said, "Dinner is at 6. I said, "Bring nothing." He laughed and said, "Come on, Dad. At least let us bring wine." I said, "I have the wine covered." He said, "All right. All right." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I looked at the screen afterward the way you look at a clock after an earthquake. Not to know the time, but to confirm that time is still moving. Marcus had said yes. He had said it the way he said everything, with warmth that cost him nothing and commitment that cost him less. He did not ask why I was suddenly hosting a dinner after 3 years of eating alone. He did not ask why I sounded different. He heard the invitation, and he accepted it the way you accept a free sample at a grocery store, without curiosity about what is inside. I spent the next 2 days cleaning the house. I swept the dining room floor and wiped down the long oak table June had bought at an estate sale in Salem in 2002. I took the good plates from the hutch, the white ones with the thin blue line around the rim, and washed each one by hand even though they were already clean. I found the candles in the sideboard drawer where June had kept them, 8 ivory tapers in a cardboard box with a rubber band around them. 2 had melted slightly at the base from a summer the air conditioning broke. I trimmed them with a kitchen knife and set them in the brass holders June's mother had given us as a wedding gift. The house began to look like it used to look. Not decorated, not staged, just ready. Ready the way a courtroom is ready, with everything in its place, and the verdict still unwritten. On December 23rd, Helen called. She said the documents are ready. All of them. I said, good. She said, Walt, are you sure about tomorrow? I said, I have never been more sure about anything except marrying June. She laughed. The first time I had heard Helen Marsh laugh in 14 years of knowing her. She said, that is exactly what June told me you would say. I woke on December 24th at 4:51 in the morning. The house was dark and cold and still. I lay in bed for a few minutes listening to the silence the way I used to listen to June breathing beside me, slow and steady. A rhythm I did not appreciate until it was gone. Then I got up and started cooking. The pot roast was June's recipe. She had written it on an index card in 1999 and taped it to the inside of the cabinet above the stove, where it had yellowed but never moved. 3 pounds of chuck roast, salt and pepper, rubbed in the night before. Sear in the Dutch oven with olive oil until each side is dark brown, 4 minutes per side. Add 2 cups of beef broth, 1 cup of red wine, 4 carrots cut into thirds, 3 potatoes quartered, 1 onion halved, 4 cloves of garlic, smashed with the flat of a knife. Bay leaves. Time. Cover. 325 degrees. For 3.5 hours. Do not open the lid. June had underlined that last part twice. She said the roast needed to be left alone to become what it was supposed to become, and every time you lifted the lid, you were telling it you did not trust it. I had always thought she was talking about the meat. Now I was not so sure. By 9, the house smelled like Sunday. That is the only way I can describe it. The scent of slow-cooked beef and root vegetables filled every room and settled into the walls and the curtains and the wool blanket on the back of the couch, and for the first time in 3 years, the farmhouse smelled like someone lived in it on purpose. I set the table at 11. 8 chairs around the long oak table. June's white plates with the thin blue rim. The brass candle holders with the trimmed ivory tapers. Cloth napkins she had bought at a craft fair in Carlton. Dark green with a small embroidered vine on the corner. 1 for each setting. Wine glasses, the good ones. The ones with the thin stems she told me to never put in the dishwasher. I placed them carefully. 1 at each seat, and when I stood back and looked at the table, I saw something I had not seen in a very long time. I saw a table that expected people. At noon, I went to the cellar. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the air changed as I descended, from the warm kitchen smell to the cool mineral quiet of underground. The cellar was small, 12 feet by 14, with stone walls. June and I had sealed ourselves in 2003. Wooden racks lined 3 walls. Most were empty now. I had sold much of the inventory in 2022 when the medical bills arrived, and what remained was modest. 14 bottles of the 2012 Pinot Noir. 9 bottles of the 2016 Reserve. A case of the 2019 Estate that Rosa had helped blend during her last harvest before Ernesto's death. And on the bottom rack alone, in the center, 1 bottle of the 1998 Reserve, the last bottle. The one June had told me to protect. The one that had already been opened once in my son's Portland dining room, except it had not. Because that bottle was the 5th bottle, and this was the 6th. And the 6th had been here the entire time, waiting in the dark, the way June's cassette had waited in Helen's drawer. I picked it up. The label was slightly faded. The capsule was intact. I held it at an angle and looked at the sediment along the bottom, 26 years of time, compressed into a thin, dark line. I carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen counter and did not open it. At 3:15, Frank arrived. He came in through the side door without knocking, the way he had done for 4 decades, carrying a cherry pie in a glass dish covered with aluminum foil. He set it on the counter and looked at the table and looked at me and said June would be proud. I said I hope so. He said I know so, and the difference between hope and know sat in the room like a third person. Frank helped me move the extra chairs from the porch. We worked without talking much, the way men do when the work is simple and the weight is somewhere else. He asked once if I was nervous. I said no. He looked at me and said liar. I said maybe a little. He said good. That means it matters. At 4:30, Pastor David arrived. He wore a dark blue suit and a tie I had never seen, gray with small silver crosses. He shook my hand at the door and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, which is something David does when he wants you to know he is not just greeting you. He looked at the table and the candles and the plates, and he said this looks like a communion. I said it might be. At 5:15, a truck I did not recognize pulled into the gravel drive. Rosa stepped out of the driver's side wearing a dark red dress and boots, and she opened the back door and lifted Mateo onto the ground. He was wearing a white button-down shirt tucked into khaki pants, and his hair was combed to the side, and he looked like a small, serious man attending an important meeting. He saw me on the porch and ran across the gravel shouting, "Mr. Walt, Mr. Walt," and I crouched down and caught him the way I used to catch Marcus 30 years ago. With both arms and all my weight leaned back so the momentum would not knock us over. Rosa walked up the steps and hugged me. She smelled like lavender and cold air. She said, "The vineyard looks good, Mr. Walt." I said, "It is holding on." She looked at me the way Ernesto used to look at a vine he was not sure about, careful and patient and unwilling to make a judgment until he had seen every leaf. She said, "So are you." I brought them inside. Mateo saw the table and stopped walking. He counted the plates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He looked up at me and said, "Who are all these people?" I said, "They are the people who matter." It was 5:42. Marcus and Tessa were not here yet. Dinner was at 6. I went to the kitchen and checked the roast. The lid was still on. I had not opened it once. They arrived at 5:58. 2 minutes before 6. Close enough to be punctual. Late enough to make everyone else already seated. I heard the car before I saw it. A black Audi sedan, the one Tessa had leased in September, pulling into the gravel drive with the kind of quiet engine that costs more than most people's monthly rent. The headlights swept across the porch and the vineyard beyond it. And for a moment the bare vines lit up white against the dark like bones in an X-ray. Marcus stepped out of the passenger side. He was wearing a charcoal sport coat over a black sweater. No tie. The collar open in a way that was meant to look casual, but had been considered. He carried a bottle of wine in his left hand. I had told him not to bring anything. He brought it anyway. That was Marcus. Generous with gestures. Careful with everything else. Tessa came around from the driver's side. She wore a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks and a thin gold necklace that caught the porch light as she turned. Her hair was pulled back. Her smile was already on. She had the kind of face that was always ready to be pleasant. The way a hotel lobby is always ready to be welcoming, polished and lit and giving nothing away. Marcus came up the porch steps and hugged me. The hug lasted 3 seconds. I counted because I had started counting things I never used to count. He smelled like cologne. I did not recognize. He said, "Merry Christmas, Dad." "The house looks amazing." I said, "Thank you." He looked past me through the open door and saw the table and said, "Wow, you really went all out." I said, "Your mother's recipe." Something moved across his face when I said that. Not guilt. Not quite. More like the shadow of a bird passing over a field. There and gone before you can name the species. Tessa hugged me next. She said, "Merry Christmas, Walt. It is so good to see you." Her arms were firm, and her cheek was cold from the outside air, and her voice carried the exact warmth of someone who has practiced warmth until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. She held up a small gift bag and said just a little something. I took it and set it on the hall table without looking inside. They came into the dining room. Frank was standing by the sideboard with a glass of water. David was near the window. Rosa was at the far end of the table, adjusting Matteo's napkin. The room was warm from the kitchen heat and the candles I had lit 10 minutes earlier, and the light was the color of honey, and for a single breath, it looked exactly like every Christmas Eve dinner June had ever hosted in this room. Marcus saw Rosa and stopped. Not physically. His feet kept moving. But something behind his eyes stopped, recalculated, and resumed. He said, "Rosa, hey, great to see you." His voice was the right temperature. His smile was the right width, but his hand went to Tessa's elbow, a small touch. Automatic. The kind of signal that married people develop without knowing it. I saw it. Rosa saw it too. Rosa said, "Hello, Marcus." "Hello, Tessa. Merry Christmas." Her voice was steady and clear and carried no warmth beyond what courtesy required. Matteo looked up from his napkin and said, "Hi. Just hi." Children do not perform unless they are taught to. And Rosa had never taught Matteo to perform. I asked everyone to sit. I had placed the seats deliberately. I sat at the head, the chair that had been mine for 26 years. Frank was to my left, David to my right. Rosa and Matteo sat beside David. Marcus and Tessa sat beside Frank. The eighth chair, at the far end of the table opposite me, was empty. Marcus looked at it. He said, "Are we expecting someone else?" I said no. He looked at the plate and the glass and the napkin set at the empty place, and he did not ask again. Frank looked at me. David looked at his hands. Rosa looked at the empty chair, and I saw her lips pressed together. Just slightly. The way a person holds something in, when letting it out would change the shape of the room. The empty chair was for June. I did not say that. I did not need to. Everyone in that room knew whose place it was. Everyone except perhaps Tessa, who glanced at it once, and then turned her attention to the wine glass in front of her, the way a person steps around a puddle, without acknowledging the rain. I served the roast. I carved it at the table the way my father had carved roasts when I was a boy, standing at the head with the knife and the long fork, placing each slice on the plates one by one. The meat was dark and tender and fell apart along the grain. The carrots had softened to the color of late October. The potatoes had taken on the broth and the wine and the thyme. And the smell that rose from the Dutch oven was the smell of this house at its best, the smell of someone caring enough to cook slowly. I poured the wine. Not the 1998. Not yet. I opened a bottle of the 2012 Pinot Noir. A good vintage. Honest and balanced. The kind of wine that does not demand attention but rewards it. I poured for Frank and David and Rosa and Marcus and Tessa. I did not pour for Matteo. I poured a glass for the empty chair. Marcus watched me do it. He said nothing. We ate. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation moved. The way conversations move at holiday dinners when not everyone at the table knows each other well. Frank talked about the weather. David mentioned the church Christmas service that morning. Tessa complimented the roast twice. Marcus asked about the vineyard, how the vines were holding up this winter. I told him they were dormant. He said, "Right, of course, dormant." The word sat in the air between us. Dormant. Resting. Waiting. Alive beneath the surface, but showing nothing. Matteo ate his carrots with his fingers. Rosa cut his potatoes into small pieces without interrupting the conversation. At one point, Matteo leaned over to David and whispered something I could not hear, and David smiled and whispered something back. And Matteo laughed, a sound so clean and uncomplicated that it made the candle flames seem to lean toward him. At 6:34, I looked around the table. Frank was watching me. David was watching me. Rosa was looking at her plate, but her hands were still. Marcus was refilling Tessa's glass. Tessa was smiling at something no one had said. I put down my fork. I placed my hands on the table, one on each side of my plate, the way Helen had placed her hands on her desk when she was about to say something that could not be unsaid. I said I would like to say a few words. The room went quiet. Even Matteo stopped chewing. I looked at each person at the table before I spoke. Frank, who had been beside me longer than anyone alive. David, who had buried my wife and my best friend in the same year and never once told me God had a plan because he knew I was not ready to hear it. Rosa, whose hands were folded in her lap the way Ernesto's used to fold when he was listening carefully. Matteo, who had stopped chewing a piece of carrot and was holding it in his cheek like a chipmunk. Marcus, whose smile had not yet left his face. And Tessa, whose eyes had already moved to her phone on the table and then back up again, quick as a reflex. I said I want to thank everyone for being here. This is the first Christmas Eve dinner in this house since June passed. Some of you knew her well. Some of you knew her your entire life. She loved this room. She loved this table. She loved the idea that people could sit together and be honest with each other, even when honesty was hard, especially when it was hard. Marcus shifted in his chair. A small movement. The kind you make when you are comfortable, but something in the air has changed, and your body knows it before your mind does. I said I have something I want to share with all of you tonight. I reached under my chair where I had placed the Sony recorder that morning. Tucked inside a cloth bag June had sewn for carrying wine bottles to picnics. I set the recorder on the table beside my plate. Marcus looked at it. Tessa looked at it. Frank already knew. David had been told. Rosa had not. I said this is a recording June made on March 14th, 2021. 5 weeks before she entered hospice. She recorded it on this machine and gave it to our attorney, Helen Marsh, with instructions to hold it until it was needed. Helen gave it to me 2 weeks ago. I have listened to it many times. Now, I would like you to hear it. I pressed play. June's voice entered the room, the way sunlight enters a room. When you open curtains you have kept closed for too long. It did not crash in. It arrived, quietly, steadily, filling the corners first and then the center. Hi, sweetheart. It is March 14th, 2021, a Sunday. Rosa's hand went to her mouth. I saw her eyes fill before the second sentence was finished. Matteo looked up at his mother, and then at the recorder, and then at me. Confused but quiet, sensing that the adults around him had entered a space he could not follow. June's voice moved through the room. She talked about Marcus, about the deed, about the word property, about Tessa writing down the appraisal number on her phone. Every word was clear because the kitchen acoustics that June had chosen for the recording were the same acoustics we were sitting in now. Her voice bounced off the same walls. It filled the same air. Marcus did not move for the first 2 minutes. His fork was on his plate. His hands were on the edge of the table. His face was the face of a man watching a car accident from across the street. Close enough to see the details, but too far to stop anything. Then June said the line I had listened to more than any other. He sees a number. I do not know what the number is exactly, but I know he has been looking at it. Marcus looked at me. Not at the recorder. At me. His eyes were wide, and his jaw was tight, and his breathing had changed. Shorter now, shallow, the way a person breathes when the ground they are standing on turns out to be thinner than they thought. Tessa's hand moved to Marcus's arm. Not a comfort. A signal. I had seen that same hand go to his elbow when they arrived. It meant stop. It meant wait. It meant do not react, until I tell you how to react." The tape continued. June talked about protecting the vineyard. For the land. For Ernesto. For Rosa. For Mateo. For me. When she said the line about peace and justice, peace is not the same as justice, and sometimes the people we love the most are the ones we need to protect things from. David closed his eyes. Frank looked at the empty chair. Rosa was crying without making a sound, her tears falling onto the green napkin with the embroidered vine. The recorder clicked. The tape ended. The room was so quiet. I could hear the candle wicks burning. No one spoke for 11 seconds. I counted them the way I had been counting everything since November. Then Marcus spoke. His voice was lower than usual, controlled. He said, "Dad, I do not know what Mom thought she saw, but this is not what it looks like." He said she was sick. She was on medication. She was not thinking clearly. I let him finish. I let every word land on the table between us, the way you let a card player lay down their hand before you show yours. Then I said, "Marcus, I know about Cole Strategic Consulting LLC. I know about the $47,000. I know that Phil Langford shared my financial records with Tessa on January 11th, 2023. Without my knowledge or consent, I know about the 12 emails between you and Cascade Hospitality Group between August 9th and September 3rd of this year. I know about the letter of intent you signed on August 22nd using a signature your mother taught you. And I know that you described me to a hotel developer as 62, healthy, no direct heirs, and estimated 18 to 24 months before the vineyard would be available." The room did not move. Frank was staring at the table. David's eyes were still closed. Rosa had stopped crying and was looking at Marcus with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was recognition, the look of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has just been told they were right. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said, "Dad, let me explain." Tessa's hand tightened on his arm. He said it was exploratory. It was just a conversation. "We were trying to help you plan for the future." I said, "The future?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Whose future?" "Marcus." He did not answer. Tessa spoke for the first time. Her voice was even and precise, the voice of a financial consultant addressing a board meeting. She said, "Walt, these are complicated matters, and I think it would be better to discuss them privately, without an audience." She glanced at David. She glanced at Rosa. She said, "This is a family matter." I said, "Everyone at this table is family." Tessa's smile remained, but something behind it cracked. Not visibly. Not the way glass cracks. The way ice cracks on a pond. A sound you hear before you see the line. I reached under my chair again and took out the blue legal binder Helen had prepared. I set it on the table. I said, "This is an irrevocable living trust established on December 23rd, 2024, naming Rosa Elena Medina as the sole beneficiary of this vineyard and this house. The trust is managed by Evergreen Trust Services of Salem. It cannot be reversed. It cannot be challenged. It is done." Marcus stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. The sound was loud in the silent room, sharp, like a match being struck. He said, "You cannot do this." His voice was no longer controlled. It was the voice of a boy who has been caught and does not yet know how to be a man about it. He said, "This is my home. This is my name on the deed." I said it was. I reached into the binder and took out a second document. I said, "This is a quitclaim deed, removing your name from the property." It was filed with the Yamhill County Clerk's office yesterday afternoon. Marcus looked at Tessa. Tessa looked at the binder. For the first time since I had known her, Tessa Cole Brennan had nothing to say. Marcus left at 7:12. I know because the clock on the kitchen wall ticked once in the silence after his chair hit the floor, and I looked at it the way sailors look at a compass in a storm, not for direction, but for confirmation that the instruments still work. He did not say goodbye. He pushed back from the table, and the chair tipped and fell behind him, and he walked through the dining room and down the hall and out the front door. He did not take his coat from the hook. He did not take the bottle of wine he had brought. The front door opened and closed, and then his footsteps crossed the porch and hit the gravel, and the car door opened and closed, and for a moment there was nothing, just the engine turning over in the December dark. Tessa did not leave immediately. She sat at the table for 4 more seconds, her eyes on the blue legal binder, the way a chess player looks at a board after realizing the game ended 3 moves ago. Then she stood. She straightened her blouse. She picked up her phone from the table and dropped it into her purse and looked at me and said, "You will be hearing from our attorney." I said, "I expect I will." She walked out. Her heels clicked against the hardwood in the hallway, a sound so measured and even that it could have been a metronome. The front door opened and closed a second time. The Audi started. The headlights swept across the porch and the vineyard, and then turned down the driveway and were gone. The room was still. The candles were still burning. The pot roast was still on the table, half carved, the broth cooling around the potatoes. June's glass of wine sat untouched at the empty chair. The green napkin at Marcus's place had been pulled off the table when his chair fell. It lay on the floor like a leaf that had come loose from a branch. Frank was the first to move. He bent down and picked up Marcus's chair and set it upright and pushed it back against the table. He did not say anything. He just fixed the chair because it was knocked over, and Frank has spent his entire life putting things back where they belong. David opened his eyes. He had kept them closed through most of my speech, not out of avoidance but out of reverence. The way a man closes his eyes during a prayer he did not expect to hear. He looked at me and said, "Walt, that was the hardest thing I have ever witnessed at a dinner table, and I have done marriage counseling." The line could have been a joke. It was not. His voice was too steady for humor. Rosa had not moved. Matteo was leaning against her side with his head on her arm, and she was holding him with one hand and pressing the other flat against the table, the way a person presses their hand against a wall when the room is spinning. She was not crying anymore. Her face was quiet and open and entirely present. The face of a woman who has just been handed something enormous and is still measuring its weight. I said, "Rosa, I am sorry you had to hear all of that." She looked at me and said, "Do not apologize, Mr. Walt. I would rather hear the truth at a table than a lie over the phone." I nodded. I did not tell her yet what the trust meant in full. That would come later. In Helen's office, with documents and explanations, and the careful language of legal transfer. Tonight was not for paperwork. Tonight was for the thing that comes before paperwork. The moment when someone looks at you and you look back, and both of you understand that something has shifted and will not shift back. David helped me clear the table. Frank washed the dishes. Rosa put Matteo on the couch with a blanket and he fell asleep in under 3 minutes, his shoes still on, his white shirt untucked, his mouth slightly open. Children can sleep through anything when they feel safe. That is how you know they feel safe. We sat in the living room after the kitchen was clean. Frank had coffee. David had tea. Rosa had a glass of the 2012 Pinot Noir, and she held it up to the lamp and looked at the color the way Ernesto used to hold soil up to the light, reading it for things invisible to anyone who had not spent decades learning to look. She said, "This is a beautiful wine, Mr. Walt." I said, "Your father helped make it." She said, "I know." She took a sip and closed her eyes, and I saw Ernesto in her face so clearly it hurt. The same cheekbones, the same quiet concentration, the same way of being fully inside a moment without needing to announce it. Frank left at 9. He shook my hand at the door and held it and said, "You did the right thing." I said, "I hope so." He said, "Stop saying hope." He picked up the cherry pie dish, which was empty because David had eaten 3 slices, and walked to his truck and drove away with his headlights cutting through the vineyard dark. David left at 9:20. He stood on the porch and looked out at the vines and said, "Walt, I do not know if you are a man of faith." I said, "I am a man of soil, David." He smiled and said, "That is close enough." He put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed once and walked to his car. Rosa carried Matteo to her truck at 9:45. He was still asleep, his head on her shoulder, one arm hanging loose. She buckled him into the car seat and closed the door quietly and came back to the porch. She stood in front of me and said, "I do not know what to say, Mr. Walt." I said, "You do not have to say anything tonight." She said, "My father loved this place." I said, "I know." She said, "I love it too." I said, "I know that too." She drove away. The taillights disappeared down the county road, and the vineyard was dark, and the house was quiet, and I was alone again. But the alone felt different now. Not empty, not abandoned, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something necessary has been said. I went inside and locked the door and picked up the green napkin from the floor where Marcus's chair had been. I folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. Then I checked my phone. 11 missed calls from Marcus. The first at 7:14, 2 minutes after he left. The last at 9:38. He had not left a single voicemail. 11 calls and no words. I thought about that. A man who calls 11 times and says nothing is a man who does not know what to say. Which means he is either very sorry or very scared, and in my experience, those two things feel the same at first, but lead to very different places. I did not call him back. I set the phone on the counter and turned off the kitchen light. The candles in the dining room had burned down to their brass holders, the wax pooled and hardened into small ivory lakes. I left them. June always said the best part of candles was the shape they left behind. I went to bed. I did not dream. Marcus did not call on Christmas Day. The phone sat on the kitchen counter where I had left it the night before, and I checked it once in the morning and once in the afternoon, and both times the screen showed nothing. No calls, no texts, no voicemails. The 11 missed calls from the night before sat in the log like footprints in wet concrete, hardening into something permanent with every hour that passed. I spent Christmas morning in the vineyard. The air was 31 degrees, and the frost had settled on the trellis wires like thin white thread. I walked the east block from row 1 to row 47 and back again, the way I had walked it 1,000 times before. But this time my hands were in my pockets, and I was not checking anything. I was just walking. The vines were bare and dark and patient, each one a kind of faith, a belief that spring would come even when every visible sign said otherwise. On December 27th, Helen called. She said Marcus's attorney had made contact. His name was Derek Soto, a property litigation specialist from a firm in Portland. Helen said Soto had requested copies of the trust documents and the quitclaim deed, and had indicated that Marcus was considering a legal challenge on 2 grounds. First, that the quitclaim deed was signed under what he called incomplete disclosure, meaning Marcus did not fully understand what he was relinquishing. Second, that the irrevocable trust was established under undue influence, meaning someone had pressured me into disinheriting my own son. Helen told me not to worry. She said the quitclaim deed was signed voluntarily in her office on December 18th, 6 days before the dinner. She had walked Marcus through every line. She had asked him 3 times if he understood what he was signing. She had recorded the session with his consent. Marcus had signed because Helen had framed it as a routine estate simplification, a way to clean up the title before a new will was drafted. He had not asked questions because he believed the vineyard was coming to him anyway, and a cleaner title only made that easier. He had signed away his claim to the property, thinking he was polishing it. Helen said the recording alone would dismiss the first challenge. As for the second, she said an irrevocable trust established by a competent adult with independent legal counsel and a professional fiduciary cannot be overturned on the basis of undue influence without extraordinary evidence. She said Derek Soto knew that. She said this call was not a legal strategy. It was a reflex. I asked her how long it would take. She said Soto would file a formal objection within 30 days. The county would review it. There would be a hearing, probably in March. She said she expected the objection to be denied. She said the trust was solid. The deed was solid. The evidence was solid. She said, "Walt, You built this the right way. On January 2nd, Tessa sent me a text message. It was 3 sentences long. It said, "Walt, I want you to know that I never intended any harm to you or to June's memory. Marcus and I were only trying to ensure the vineyard's long-term viability. I hope in time you will see that." I read it twice. I thought about the $47,000 that had moved through Cole Strategic Consulting, LLC. I thought about the email to Cascade describing me as 62, healthy, no direct heirs. I thought about the appraisal number Tessa had written on her phone while June was standing right there. Then I deleted the message. Some sentences are not worth keeping. On January 8th, Phil Langford called. He did not call my number. He called Helen's office. Helen told me he was apologetic and frightened, and that he had used the word misunderstanding 4 times in a 7-minute conversation. She said he offered to provide a written statement confirming that Tessa had contacted him and that he had shared my financial information without my authorization. Helen said she accepted the offer. She said Phil's statement would be useful if the hearing went forward, and even if it did not, it was now part of the permanent record. I did not feel anger toward Phil. I felt the kind of disappointment you feel when a tool you trusted turns out to have a crack you never noticed. On January 15th, Frank came over for coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the spot where Marcus's chair had been and said, "Have you heard from him?" I said no. Frank said nothing for a while. Then he said, "When my brother and I stopped speaking in 1989, it took us 11 years to find our way back." I asked him what happened after 11 years. He said our mother died. I said that is a terrible reason to reconcile. He said most reasons are. On January 20th, Marcus called. Not 11 times, once. At 8:14 in the evening, I was sitting on the porch with a blanket over my legs, and the dog beside me, and the vineyard stretching out under a sky so clear I could see the ridgeline of the Coast Range against the stars. The phone rang, and I looked at the screen and saw his name, and I let it ring 4 times before I answered. He said, "Dad." Just that. Dad. His voice was not controlled. It was not strategic. It was not the voice of a man with talking points prepared by an attorney. It was the voice of a boy sitting in the back seat of a station wagon at 11 years old, asking if we were almost there, tired and unsure, and hoping the answer was yes. I said, "I am here, Marcus." He said, "I am sorry." He said, "I do not know how it got this far." He said, "Tessa had the plan, and I went along with it, because it was easier than thinking about what it meant." He said, "I told myself it was for the family." He said, "I know that is not true." He said, "I know what I did. I listened. I did not interrupt." June had always told me that the most important part of a conversation is the part where you do not speak, and I had never understood that until now. He said, "Can I come home?" Not to the vineyard. Not to the property. Home. I said, "You can come home when you are ready to come home, Marcus." But home is not the same as it was. Some doors close, and they do not open the same way again. They open, but the hinges remember. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "Okay, Dad. Okay." We hung up. I sat on the porch and looked at the vineyard and thought about what I had said. The hinges remember. I did not know if that was wisdom or cruelty or both. I supposed it did not matter. It was true. And true things do not need to be categorized to be real. The hearing was held on March 11th in the Yamhill County Courthouse, a building made of pale brick and old wood that smelled the way all courthouses smell, like paper and patience and decisions that cannot be taken back. Helen presented the trust documents, the quitclaim deed, the recorded consent session, Phil Langford's written statement, and the Cascade email chain. Derek Soto presented Marcus's objection. The judge, a woman named Catherine Oberg, who had been on the bench for 19 years, reviewed everything in 40 minutes and denied the challenge in language, so plain it did not require a law degree to understand. She said the trust was properly established. The deed was voluntarily executed, and the evidence of financial misconduct by the petitioner undermined any claim of undue influence by the grantor. She looked at Marcus when she said that. Marcus looked at the table. After the hearing, Helen walked me to my truck. She said, "It is done, Walt." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like a man who has finished plowing a field he did not want to plow." She smiled and said, "That is the most vineyard thing anyone has ever said to me." I thanked her for everything. She said, "Do not thank me. Thank June. She is the one who started this." Helen was right. June had started it. 3 years before the TikTok video and the wire transfers and the emails, she had sat in our kitchen on a Sunday morning and spoken into a silver recorder and handed the tape to a woman she trusted and said, "Not yet." Everything that followed, every document, every conversation, every seat at that dinner table, had grown from that single act, the way a vine grows from a single root, invisible at first, and then undeniable. I drove home. The valley was turning green. It was early March, and the rain had been steady for weeks, and the cover crops between the rows had come in thick, clover and rye and vetch, a living carpet that held the soil in place and fed the roots beneath it. The vines were still dormant, but not for long. I could see the buds beginning to swell at the nodes, small and tight and ready, and I knew that within 3 weeks the first leaves would unfurl, and the vineyard would begin another year of becoming what it had always been. Rosa came to the vineyard on the last Saturday of March. She brought Mateo and a suitcase, and a box of Ernesto's tools she had kept in her Portland apartment for 3 years. She carried the box to the barn and set it on the workbench beside the grafting bench Ernesto had built in 2004. The one she had rescued from under the tarps after Marcus refused to call her back. She arranged the tools in the order Ernesto had kept them, pruning shears on the left, grafting knife in the center, twine and tape on the right. And when she was done, she stood back and looked at the bench. The way you look at a grave you have finally learned to visit without falling apart. Mateo ran straight to the vineyard. He did not wait for permission. He ran between the rows with his arms out, touching the vine trunks as he passed. And when he reached row 12, he stopped and pressed his face against a trunk and breathed in and turned back to Rosa and shouted, "Mama, it still smells like abuelo." Rosa looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us spoke. Some moments are too complete for language. They exist fully formed, and any word you add to them only makes them smaller. That evening I cooked dinner. Not a formal dinner. Not a performance. Rice and beans and roasted chicken. A recipe Ernesto had taught me in 2008 when I told him I was tired of eating the same 4 meals, and he said, "Mr. Walt, you have been eating like a man who does not expect company." He had been right. I had been eating alone even when June was alive, not physically but spiritually, approaching food as fuel rather than as gathering. Ernesto had changed that. He had taught me that a meal cooked slowly and shared freely was a kind of language, and that the table was the only place in the world where sitting still counted as doing something. Rosa and I ate at the kitchen table with Mateo between us. He talked about school and about a dog his friend had, and about a dream where he flew over the vineyard and could see every single grape from the sky. He asked me how many grapes were in the vineyard. I told him I did not know. He said somebody should count them. I said maybe that could be his job someday. He considered this seriously. The way 5-year-old children consider things, with total commitment and no irony, and then he said, "Okay, but I will need a very big notebook." After dinner, I put Mateo to bed in the guest room. Rosa had made it up with sheets from the hall closet and a quilt June had sewn in 2015, the one with the pattern of interlocking vines that June said represented the way lives grow around each other without knowing it. Mateo fell asleep holding the edge of the quilt in one hand, and I stood in the doorway and watched him breathe and thought about what June had said on the tape. For Mateo, who will not remember me but who deserves to stand where I stood and know that someone loved this place enough to keep it whole. He was standing where she stood. He was 5 years old and asleep and holding a quilt she made, and he did not know any of that. But the vineyard knew. The soil knew. The rows that Ernesto planted and June watered and I pruned knew. Land remembers even when people forget. La tierra recuerda. Ernesto used to say that when the harvest was good, after a hard year, the land remembers. Rosa and I sat on the porch after Mateo was asleep. The night was cool, but not cold. The vineyard was dark under a half moon, and I could hear the creek at the bottom of the south slope. A sound so familiar, it was almost silence. I went inside and came back with the bottle. The 1998 Reserve. The last bottle. The one June told me to open when I was ready. I set it on the small table between our chairs. Rosa looked at it, and her breath caught. She knew what it was. She had been there for the first harvest. She was 7 years old, and Ernesto had let her carry one cluster of grapes to the sorting table, and she had carried it with both hands like it was made of glass. I opened the bottle. The cork came out whole, which after 26 years is not guaranteed, and felt like a small benediction. I poured 2 glasses. The wine was dark, almost black at the center, with a thin garnet rim that caught the porch light. It smelled like earth and dried roses, and something I could not name, something that existed only because time had passed and the wine had been patient enough to wait. I handed Rosa a glass. I raised mine. I said to June, to Ernesto, to the land that remembers. Rosa touched her glass to mine. The sound was small and clear, a single note that held in the air for a moment, and then was gone. We drank. The wine was extraordinary. Not because it was complex or rare or valuable, though it was all of those things. It was extraordinary because it tasted exactly like 1998, like the year we bought the land, like the year Ernesto knelt in row 1 and pushed the first root into the ground, like the year June stood on the porch with a glass in her hand and said, "Walt, I think this might be the best thing we have ever done." She was right. It was.